Saudi oil, right? Let's talk about that. Huge buyer, China, probably Saudi's top buyer. A lot of people view the president's trip as, okay, all these deals which made headlines, right? Billions of dollars worth, which we can talk about as well. But also, under the radar, this seemed to me at least to be sort of a diplomatic sort of check against China. China's also involved in infrastructure, telecommunications in Saudi as well. But this is the U.S. trying to say, look, we're here as well, Saudi.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. And that I would put it in the context of the overall strategic competition that you have between the United States and China, which has been going on for some time, and I think which has accelerated in the last couple of years. Part of the debate is around investment, for example, in infrastructure. The United States wants to encourage economies like Saudi and the GCC economies to invest more in infrastructure with the US and its partners, as opposed to relying entirely on China. I think the difference is that China brings in capital, know-how, manufacturing. They are truly the number one when it comes to development of heavy infrastructure. And so the other party has to bring up something to the table, and that's always a challenge.
So as private money, focusing on infrastructure, very bullish on Saudi Arabia, what are some of the things that you need to think about, the considerations that you need to make given the geopolitical complexities, and what kind of projects are you looking at the moment in Saudi Arabia?
You talk about political considerations and complexities. Yeah. You're absolutely right. The fact is, you have those complexities in the world we're in today across the board.
Sure.
You have those complexities in the United States, you have them in Europe, you have them in Asia. So across the board, the level of complexity and uncertainty has gone up. I think Saudi is trying to move away from a reliance on hydrocarbon. And I think they're doing that relatively successfully, albeit probably slower than they would want to. So energy transition is an important element in that. The development of the basic infrastructure, logistics and otherwise, is extremely important. So there's a lot of sectors which they'll need to develop over the coming years to, frankly, bring up the economy so that they can play a bigger role in the region.
I actually enjoyed the piece that you had on FT, and you were talking about how the infrastructure revolution in the United States should be more private-led rather than government-led. Would you say that that's happening in the Middle East at the moment?
It's not happening yet. So most of the investments are government-led. But when you look at budget deficits and you look at the strain on government spending, it's not sustainable. And that's true in whether it's in the Middle East or in Europe or in the United States. After all, the US has a budget deficit of 6% as of GDP, which is probably going to go towards 10%. And from that perspective, you need to be able to bring alternative sources of capital, specifically the private sector, in the context of public-private partnership to effectively allow that kind of investment.
So talk to us a little bit more about this whole PPP model, right? And we can get on to Asia, since you're touring this part of the world, and the $1 trillion infrastructure deficit which still exists. But for the Middle East, for Saudi specifically, right, at least for now, the deficit isn't a worry, right? At some stage, though, yeah, they're going to have to think very hard about involving private money. How is that going to work? Because usually when you talk about investment into something like infrastructure for private money, it looks good, right, as long as it's regulated, right, and there's that kind of certainty, right, for your cash flow. But, they've been reluctant to engage a lot because where public-private partnerships are involved, it's often hard for private money to earn a decent return. In Saudi, what is the case now?
I think that is still relatively the case, because the government has, as I said, dominated the investment in infrastructure. Having said that, because they're looking at investing in multiple sectors in infrastructure, creating new cities, investing massively in technology, they need to be able to bring in the private sector. You have, by the way, a vibrant domestic private sector in Saudi Arabia. And so what you're looking to do is, over time, reduce the involvement of the Saudi government's investments in infrastructure, increase the regulatory framework that allows you to have foreign investors come in a regulatory framework that allows you to have a good sense of what the expected return ought to be. So as long as you had the government that dominated, the government, of course, regulates itself, right? And so that's the balance that you want.
So here's a cheeky question, right? Whenever the private sector is involved in something like infrastructure, you're looking for a decent return. So good for you guys if you're able to achieve that, right? But infrastructure often involves a public good, right? Whether it's electricity or water or anything else, or a toll road, right? Are you able to say that even after you're able to make a decent return, right, for your investors, right, you can guarantee, or is it the government's job to guarantee that prices for whatever the public good is, electricity, water, are still affordable and they don't go up?
Yeah. And Sherry, you mentioned the article in the FT about the fact that I talk about an infrastructure revolution. One of the challenges that you have in privatizing infrastructure or bringing in the private sector into that mix is exactly what you said. Some of it is a public good, and some of it could be considered not as a public good. So in the case of water, in the case of electricity, if you look at the United States, you have a regulated framework. In the case of UK, although it's a bit controversial these days, in the case of water distribution, you have a regulated framework. That regulated framework is there to be able to provide an expected return over a long period of time for investors in the context of a stable environment and prices that will not increase too much. Okay. So what are those sectors that are considered to be public good, and what are the sectors that are public, but really ought to be private? So parking, streets, parking garages, is that public or that's private?
Hybrid.
A hybrid. And so most of the time, what the government should do is provide the environment for a stable regulatory framework, but the risk, the commercial risk, ought to stay with the private sector.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.